life is tough, so keep your eyes on God. There's going to be a lot of difficulty that we see here in this section of Genesis. And so I'll start us today with just a question, kind of lands no matter what your age is. So whether you're a kid, whether you're a teenager, whether you're a young adult, whether you're a mature adult, whatever we want to say, right? At any point in your life, you're going to find a reason to have to trust God with certain transitions and certain unknowns, right? I mean, that's just life. And so right now, in our country is a very uncertain time. And so there's a lot of people asking questions, like tough questions, whether they're kids, right? So kids are going to be asking questions, like they see the tension. They may not always understand the politics or the financials or anything like that, but they understand this a tense time, right? And they can see their parents maybe dealing with that. So they may be asking questions like, are we going to be okay, right? Is the health of maybe a family member going to be okay? Is my mom or dad's job going to be okay? There's lots of questions that can come up even in a teenager's life about these kinds of things, these transitions. Now, if you're the parent or if you're the grandparent, obviously you're going to be asking questions like that as well. Adding into all that, as a nation, we're having to reckon with the reality that we recently just had an assassination attempt on a former president. That changes things. Hopefully it does. Right? Hopefully it does. Hopefully that changes how we think about one another and how we talk about even in politics and things like that. Time will tell if we learn a lesson from this or not. But it creates a different culture, a different atmosphere, certainly, that we have to reckon with as a people. So in all that, there's going to be a lot of opportunity to apply this morning what we're talking about. Because when you come up against really difficult times or really difficult transitions, you have to begin to ask yourself, well, what's anchoring you? Right? When life is unfair, or life is hard, or life is uncertain, you have to ask what is anchoring you. Like you have to, right? And so what we're going to see, we're going to be in Genesis 25 in a little bit. So, just so you know, that's where we're headed. But in Genesis 25 especially, you're going to see as they go through, if you read through, like if you just read through it, it's just like, wow, there's a lot of names. Next chapter, please. Right? And but if you slow down and you say, but what's going on with these people? What's the story that's being told? Then all of a sudden, like, it kind of opens up a little bit. And it's like, okay, so this is how this can legit apply in 2024. Because mind you, the stuff we're going to read together, we know is historically it's 4,000 years old. That's crazy to me, right? Like if you ask me, hey, what'd you guys do on vacation on Wednesday? No idea. No idea, right? And it was just like a week and a half ago. So we're talking, this is like ancient truth here. And in a lot of ways, though, I think that that's what we need. Like we need things that have been true forever, not just true for 10 minutes on TikTok. You know what I'm saying? Like we need something deeper and longer as a nation, no matter what age we are. So in all this stuff, as we're asking, like, what's going to happen with my family? What's going to happen with my friends? Will my kids, my grandkids, my friends, my classmates, like, are they going to be safe? Are they going to make it? Right? Like all that stuff actually does funnel into what we're talking about today. So here's what's going on, more or less. So big picture today, Genesis 25. Abraham, who we've been with forever now in Genesis. And as a reminder, Abraham is a very imperfect guy. Just because people are in the Bible doesn't mean like, oh, follow everything in their life. If you do that, your life is going to be a train wreck. Okay? Like, it's not meant to just say, oh, whatever they do, wholesale. Because just because it's in the Bible doesn't mean it's biblical, if that makes sense. Right? And so we have to make sure we have to use some discernment with that. So Abraham's life is going to come to an end. We learned a lot of good lessons from him and his wife, Sarah. He's going to pass the baton on to his son, Isaac. Isaac has been talked about so much. Even still, he actually gets very little ink in the Genesis story because he's going to pass the story on to Jacob. Jacob's going to come on the scene, and he's going to do his thing, and we're going to learn more about him as we go through Genesis. But this is major transition that's happening. Baton's got to get passed down. The next generation has to step up. So if you consider yourself the next generation, a good thing to take out of this morning is like, how are you stepping into what God has for you in this story? So whether you're a teenager, whether you're almost a teenager, or teenagers' years were a long time ago for you, we want to consider, like, what does God have for me? Right? Because the cool thing about younger generations, younger people, is that God is going to do things through you. You're going to have ideas, energy, and direction that we're not necessarily going to have the older that we get. Right? Because the older you get, you're like, ugh, I don't know if I want to do that. But young people are like, let's go. Right? So, like, we need to keep that in mind. Like, everybody's important in the story of God. So, what I love about all these struggles that we're going to see in these families, and I want you to hear this for you personally, because I don't know where you are personally, is that God is showing himself working in these families in the midst of the good and the bad, the terrible, the uncertain. God is showing up in just real life, and he's a part of their story. That is such a grounding thing to remember as we look at a story and people that are 4,000 years old, right? And I want to remind you, this is not fairy tale. This is not just like moral stories. Like, we can prove historically the things that we read and talk about even 4,000 years ago. So again, this is truth that's been true forever, not just the last 10 minutes. That's what I love about what you see God doing in these families. So I do want to give you something concrete, though, to tie this morning into, because our principle for this morning that I really want you to latch onto is this right here. Faith and prayer will guide you through difficult transitions. So I'm going to speak in a minute why I've got that picture up there. But I want to make it concrete. I want to give you something to take with you to think about this principle with today. So I'm going to do that in the context of cave diving. Has anybody ever cave dived? Has anybody ever been caving or spelunking, as they say? So when I was in college, one of the jobs I got to have, of many, was I got to be a part of an outdoor adventures company. So most of the time what I did for that company is I was a river guide. And that was awesome. That was a lot of fun. Every now and then, though, I would get to take people caving. Not so much fun for me because I didn't know what I was doing, right? And I was expected to be a guide. And so they basically they didn't give me much training. They just said, stand at the end of the line and make sure nobody gets lost or falls off into some precipice. And I was like, a precipice? That sounds big. And they're like, yeah, it is. And I was like, so my job, literally, the lead guide would take everybody through, and then there was a middle guide, to keep kind of the, stragglers going. And then my job was to sweep everybody in the back and make sure everybody was keeping up and that nobody died, essentially. And so every now and then, throughout the trip, the guides would always tell everybody to turn off their headlamps. And there's no dark like the dark inside of a cave. I mean, your eyes and your brain are like, what's going on right now? Because there is literally no light to be found. And so you're just like doing this and you can't see anything, right? And it's the weirdest thing ever. And then there's some points when we're going through this cave, and I remember getting to this one spot. It was just a little land bridge, and I shined my lamp down and I couldn't see the bottom. It was just a black hole. And I was like, that's kind of scary. So I just kept walking, and I'm like, gosh, man, I have no idea what I'm doing back here. And then we went all through this cave. And that was a pretty intense experience. Really cool, but pretty intense experience. But then when you compare that to cave diving, okay, that's exponentially worse, right? That's just it is. As far as your danger level and how things can go so quickly wrong, that's a really intense thing. And if you remember 2018-ish, right, there was that soccer team that got lost, right, in Thailand, and they were back there. And the Taiwanese Navy sent their SEALs in, and one of those SEALs died back in there because they weren't trained to do this. So this is a really dangerous thing. And so when I was thinking about this principle of this lifeline, so we'll go to the next one. So this principle of faith and prayer are going to guide you through difficult transitions. I immediately thought of that caving experience. We really had to stick together, because if you trailed off, I mean, that'd be it. You would die in that cave because you'd have no idea how to find your way back out. And when you go diving, again, even this morning and yesterday as I was thinking about this, I found this this company that really focuses in on the world, I guess you could say, of beneath the sea. And so I was looking at reels and ropes and how you do all this stuff. And here's what they said. And here's the kind of the anchor I want us to think about this morning. They said this about your lifeline. They said the most crucial piece of equipment to a cave diver is their reel, right? And the rope that obviously comes out from extends from it. It goes on to say, this line is laid down as the divers explore the cave network. Without it, there's no guideline back to the entrance of the cave. Even if conditions are clear, a lousy kick of the fin can ruin visibility. And this is how they end it, I think so poignantly. A cave diver's rope is literally their lifeline. And that's from Underwater Kinetics. And so this morning, the picture I want you to take is this, right? This rope right here doesn't seem like much, does it? You're not going to want to tow the trailer or your fancy boat with this thing right here, because that's going to be like a Progressive commercial, right? Or whatever those are. What is it? Not Progressive. Who does that? Accidents like me. Allstate? Allstate. Everybody's naming everyone. Geico! I don't know! It's, I don't know, something. Do I get candy? So, but accidents are going to happen, right? And so, like, real accidents, right? You're like, this might like seem like, oh, it's just an old rope. And it is. I happened to find this in the closet this morning because I wanted to use a rope in here at church. But now you lay something like this down in a cave underwater, and what does this little white rope become? It becomes your lifeline. So here's what I was thinking. As I was thinking about underwater caving and then our lifeline to God, I wondered, and I want to like challenge you with this. What if you lived your life like you were in an underwater environment that was harsh, that was beautiful and awesome, but also could be very, very, very dangerous? And at times, unfair things can happen under there, things that you didn't plan for. What if we lived our lives as if we were in that kind of an environment, and it was vital that we stayed close to our lifeline, that we made sure that our faith in God and prayer and our connection to Him was never more than an arm's length away? How different would our lives look? How much less stress would we look like, right? How much less anger would we see in our lives? How much less of that kind of stuff if we really stayed connected, as we're intended to our lifeline? Like, this is what I would love for you to think about moving forward, because this year, 2024, is not going to get any easier. Spoiler. Right? It's just going to get more intense, and if people don't like get it together and stop being so divided, we're going to continue to see more of the same, unfortunately. But you know what? Culture change has to start with somebody, doesn't it? Why not start with Christians? Why not us putting our faith in Christ and making sure that we're never too far away from our lifeline? Like, what would that look like if Christians did that? You know what I'm saying? So I just want you to think about that this morning as we look at some stories that may seem a little disconnected, because the words we read out of Psalm 54, my God is my helper. The Lord is the sustainer of my life, right? This diver here is connected to his lifeline. That's so, so important. So let's jump into Genesis 25, kind of with that in our minds. So, first verse, Genesis 25. Abraham had taken another wife whose name was Keturah. So this is after Sarah. If you're not familiar with the story of Abraham and Sarah, Sarah was with him a long time. There's a lot of lessons to learn from them. They made a lot of mistakes, but they had faith that was deep and impactful and made a difference in their lives. So she has since passed. Pastor Tim talked about that a couple weeks ago, and now he's taken a new wife, Keturah. And then in verses 1 through 4, you see the son's name. So basically, without reading the names, he has 6 other sons. That's historically important because of where they go, right? So today, people in the world today, 4,000 years later, are still looking to these verses because they trace their lineage back through these people that are talked about in these verses. It's like mind-boggling. But the Arab world is right now in Genesis 25 getting its beginning, right? Because of where these people live and how they intermingle and intermarry and how all that stuff works. So it's crazy. So this is like historical stuff happening here. But then in verse 5, right, after those names are listed, Abraham gave everything he owned to Isaac. Now, why would he do that to just Isaac? Well, Isaac is the promise. He is the promised child, right? So why is that important? Well, because Christ is going to come through him. There's this plan that God has, and it's going to work through this one child. It's not going to work through all these random people. It's going to work through this one child, because Jesus Christ is going to trace his lineage back through this right here, this story right here, this son, Isaac, right now that we're reading about. So Abraham is going to give everything he owns to this one son. However, verse 6, he's going to give gifts to the sons of his concubines. So he's got multiples now. And while he was still alive, he sent them eastward, away from his son Isaac, to the land of the east. So this is a protection. Abraham had enough foresight to say, okay, all of my sons can't live in the same place, because if Isaac's the promised son, everybody else is going to be a threat. Now, this brings up like an interesting side note as well. So yes, he's taking care of his sons, but then there's the question like, okay, so what's up with concubines in the Bible? What's up with multiple wives? Can Pastor Kyle have multiple wives and like some concubines? Can we get that? And Brittany said no in the first service and verified again in the second service. That's not an okay thing. So I wouldn't even, I like trying to keep up with one. I don't know why there's the many. I don't know what that's all about. So anyway, so the cultural side note here, the thing to think about, there are things in the Bible that you're going to see that are not godly. Again, just because they're in the Bible doesn't make them biblical. So we shouldn't be like, how do we get this concubine thing going again? Like, That's not like a concern of ours, because for a modern day Christian, you have to look at this and say, okay, there's times in the Bible where God allowed things that were cultural, not godly, not biblical, so to speak, but he allowed certain sins to happen because he was gracious to people. However, as you can see with Hagar, if you know the story of Abraham, what he did with Hagar created a lot of problems, created a lot of hate, created division, created abandonment. Like, it created a lot of issues. So if you're a Christian today, don't be like, well, God knows how I am and he'll be gracious, because the Apostle Paul in the New Testament says many times, Romans chapter 6, Ephesians, Galatians especially, he says, don't use your freedom to be stupid and sin. Like, don't do that. Like, yes, God will be gracious to you, but sometimes he's just going to let you have what you want. He's going to let you walk through that door, and he's going to let you ruin your life. He's a gentleman like that. Oh, you want to destroy your life? I'm going to tell you no. I'm going to give you examples in Scripture, and I'll even put good people in your life. But if you keep banging on that door, man, I'll let you go through it. And I'll let you get what's on the other side of it. So you see all of that happening, and then this concubinage thing that you do see across the Bible is there. And it was interesting, because then I got to wondering, well, does God ever speak specifically against it, though? And he doesn't, except to kings. Kings are the ones, he's like in Deuteronomy 17, he says, don't have many wives, because if you do, they're going to pull you away from me. Now, King Solomon had like 700 concubines and 300 wives, so he must have missed that law when he was like doing this, right? And it did. It ruined him. That was his downfall, was all these other, religions basically that he got tied up into. And so the question is, well, if he'd ever said like the normal person can't do that, that's why we have to know and read and understand Scripture. So what he does say in Genesis 2 is, what is marriage? It's between two people, right? It's between a man and a woman, and that's what marriage is. Not concubines, not polygamy, not a million other options that are out there. He said, this is marriage. Two are going to become one, and they're going to be like me in this marriage. It's going to reflect Jesus in the church. They're going to have kids, and they're going to leave spiritual legacy with those kids. Like, there's so much theology tied up into what marriage actually is, because it's a reflection of how Jesus feels about the church, about Christianity, about the people he gave his life for, right? And so it's a very deep meaning to be tied in together with the Spirit. And so, no, does he specifically say, well, don't do this, don't do this, don't do this? He just says, look, this is what marriage is. Do this, right? So that's why you have to kind of understand, too, like when you're reading through Scripture, it's like, well, it never says. It's like, okay, let's stop doing that. Let's stop living in the gray and just see what has God said, right? Because that's where his blessing is. So anyway, I just wanted to give that side note, because I know sometimes when I read through, it's like, why does God allow these things? His grace, but it's not the way. Okay, so little sidebar there. Like, let's jump into verse 7 then. Let's jump back into the passage. So this is the length. This is the end of Abraham's life. This is the length of Abraham's life, 175 years. So he's a pretty old guy. After this, you generally see lifespans continue to get shorter and shorter and shorter. By the time you get to the Psalms, about 500 years later, and then about 1,000 years later after this, it says Psalm 90, you got about 70 years, maybe 80 if you're strong. Right? That was written a long time ago, and that's basically still true globally. 77, 74 years old globally. So it's like, we're pretty much where God said we were going to be. So life continues to get shorter. And so verse 8, he took his last breath and died at a good old age, old and contented. That's a promise from Genesis 15. And he was gathered to his people. Now his sons Isaac and Ishmael buried him in the cave of Machpelah near Mamre, in the field of Ephron, son of Zohar the Hittite. And it's like, okay, what does that even mean? So basically, this is just God being faithful. This is like a son that was sent away, had such love for his father and such a relationship with his father that he came back. Because here, put yourself in this position. Say you're a parent, or say you're a child. Say to if you've got multiple kids, say to one of them, I've chosen you, you need to move out and go away. That's tough. Now imagine if one of your parents did that, like, oh, actually, sorry to break it to you, but you are not our favorite, and we need you to get out. Right? It's like, and some people are like, yeah, that's happened. I've been there. And so, but to say that real life pain that would have happened for Ishmael, for him to come back and still bury his dad, it does speak to the relationship that they did have, even though Abraham made that difficult choice. Like, hey man, Isaac's the child, and I got to protect him. I got to protect this promise. So anyway, so you see a little bit of relational stuff there. And then verse 10, this field that Abraham bought from the Hittites. So this is the field that he owned now from back in 23, where Pastor Tim preached. And so he was buried there with his wife, Sarah. So this happens just because it's setting up what's happening now, this transition to the next part of the story. So if you're the next generation, the question is, now what's going to happen now? So if you would consider yourself if you're a teenager, maybe you're in your 20s, maybe you're in your 30s, that's kind of like next upcoming generation. If you're in that area, are you ever saying to yourself, okay, how do I step in to what God has now? Because like I said earlier, you got to ask that question. Like, what's God got for me? Like, I'm not just like on the sidelines waiting, right? Jesus didn't pick a bunch of 60-year-olds. Sorry if you're in your 60s. He didn't pick a bunch of 60-year-olds for his disciples. He picked a bunch of like late teenagers and early 20s guys, right, to be his disciples. Why? Because again, that's where you got the belly full of fire. That's where it's like Jesus is like, hey, this is pretty crazy, but who's with me? And they're like, bro, I'm with you, right? Like you need people like that. That's why that's the next generation coming up. And so now we're seeing the next generation answer the call, taking the baton, doing what they need to do. That's a really amazing call, like in your own life to think like, what's God got for me? What's God got for me to do, right? And so that's what we're about to see in here. So verse 11, what we see is the wrapping up of Abraham's story. So after his death, God literally takes the blessing that was given to Abraham and he gives it to the chosen son, Isaac, who lived near a place called Be'er Lahai Roi. Now, this word blessed, this Hebrew word blessed, is berak. So this word is something that is tied to Abraham's story and is tied to the whole rest of the New Testament. So this blessing is something that I think it's an interesting thing to learn from this, because here's the question I have for you. Are you living your life in such a way? So say that you've got influence over other people. That might be a parent or a grandparent, but it might just be even a coworker, it might be a teacher, it might be a boss, whatever. Think about like who do you influence in your life? Now my question is, do you live in such a way that you're passing blessing on to those people that are coming after you? Like, really, could you say, if you ask those people, whoever those are, maybe that you have influence over, could you ask them, and would they say, yes, like I'm receiving blessing in my life because of mom, or because of dad, or because of my boss, or because of this guy that I know, or this girl that I'm in a knitting club with, right? Like whatever the random thing is that you do, like could you say that honestly about your life? My classmates feel that way. Maybe even my teachers feel that way, right? They're blessed because I'm in their class. My teachers never said that about Kyle. And in a way, I kind of hate that, right? Because I just wasn't very mature. So, but are we passing blessing along? Because that's what we're seeing happen here. So go back to the verse. After Abraham's death, God blessed his son Isaac, who lived near Be'er Lahai Roi. So there's a few lessons. Again, just because Abraham's gone doesn't mean the blessing is gone. So this speaks specifically, like think about this. This speaks specifically to people who have lost somebody. Because when we lose somebody, it can feel like there's this huge hole in our lives. And so, especially if they were like a spiritual influence for us. Abraham was. He dies, and now what happens to everybody else? This story is a reminder that God is still with you, even if you feel like things are out of control, that you don't know what's next, you don't know what to do without that person. Like, this is God saying, like, hey, I took a major player out of the story, but I'm continuing to work. Like I said earlier, this is evidence that God works in the midst of families, no matter what's going on. Because we see Isaac having to step up into this. Like, so it's a pretty powerful thing, right? So you have that can be learned out of this. And then second, no one leader is responsible for what God is doing. That's why I challenge you, if you're a younger person especially, if you're an older person, it doesn't matter. Like whatever age you are, like are you always asking? Like it's not just about Pastor Kyle. Like that's why I try to spread influence and leadership far away from myself, because this church is not about me. Like if I dropped dead when we went to Ohio, I want to know, and I know for certain our church would continue on. Like our church would still be healthy. Would it be hard? Man, I know it would be. Like I'm not dumb, right? I know that would be hard for our church, but I don't want this to be centered around Kyle. I want it to be centered around Jesus, right? Like that's what we're doing here, right? He's the cool one. He's the famous one. He's king. I'm Kyle, right? So it's not just based on one person, because Abraham had to go. Everybody has to go eventually. And then lastly is that legacy piece. Like, what am I leaving behind? Man, I want to leave behind a good legacy with the people that are in my life. So here's the transition. Here's what goes on. So verse 12, like this is where we move on. So these are the family records. That's a Hebrew word that is like really a phrase, toledot. There's 10 of them in Genesis, and it always marks something significant. So that's why I pointed it out. So these are the family records of Abraham's son Ishmael. So now Ishmael's story is coming to an end, whom Hagar the Egyptian, Sarah's slave, bore to Abraham. So this right here then goes from verses 13 to 16, and it lists his 12 sons, which become 12 tribes. Again, that may not seem very interesting, but historically it's true, right? These things that are recorded aren't just like, oh yeah, it's random information that's made up from stories. The Bible's just written by men. And it's like, okay, but it's still true, right? God still had to preserve his word for us and preserve things for 4,000 years because the Arab world is going to tie their lineage to these verses that we're reading. So this is the historical stuff, again, right? This is important stuff. Now, where did they settle? So do I have that picture of the Arabian Peninsula there, Trish? So this picture right here is where they went, right? So historically accurate. Don't worry about all the words. I don't have it up there for all the words, but this is where they settled. These verses are literally the beginning of the Arab nation, or the Arab world. So this is kind of what we're talking about here in these verses and where they went. All right, so back to 17. So this is the length of Ishmael's life, 137 years. He took his last breath and died and was gathered to his people. And they settled from Havilah, as you saw there, that kind of area, to Shur, which is opposite Egypt as you go toward Ashur. And he stayed near all his relatives. So this is the world. This is the real world where they were. So now the story turns back. It's wrapped up Abraham, which has been a long story. It wraps up Ishmael, which has been a very complicated story. But God's goodness was seen in all that. You know, he kept his promise, God did, to Ishmael and his mom. Like, I'm going to take care of you. I'm going to bless you too, even though you're going to feel like you're being cast aside. So those stories are wrapped up. Now we go to Isaac, and Isaac is the promised son. Everything has been hoped for. It's been talked about so much, but Isaac gets very little ink in the Bible. It's actually pretty interesting. Like, he's so important, and yet when his story comes, he fills, I don't know, almost an insignificant role. Something else to learn there. Are you willing to fill your role and do whatever God's calling you to do, even if you feel like it's not going to get you a lot of attention? Even if, like, you're doing it and you feel it's amazing and you're so excited and nobody cares, right? That's the brutal thing about social media, right? Like, oh, this was amazing, and then like 2 people like it. Maybe it wasn't. Maybe it didn't really matter. And it's like, that's not where we find our value, right? Like, that's not it. And so Isaac is kind of like that. He gets a very small but a hugely important transition role. He did what God called him to do, and he was faithful in it, right? So let's get into his story then. So he's going to have a couple kids that are going to be kind of messy. But again, the principle here, that faith and prayer are going to guide us through difficult transitions, because here's another huge transition. And again, Isaac and his wife, you're about to see, are going to hold on to this rope right here. Their faith in God and their connection to God that they have through prayer. Like, this is going to be vital for what's going to happen to them. So then we move into his story in verse 19. So these are the family records, again, that phrase, Toledot, of Isaac, son of Abraham, and Abraham fathered Isaac. So Abraham is still figuring very heavily into this because he is, the father of the nation of Israel. And then in verse 20, Isaac was 40 years old when he took his wife Rebekah, daughter of Bethuel the Aramean, from Padan Aram, and sister of Laban the Aramean. So that's a lot of words there. That was like an alphabet sandwich right there, right? So basically, what is this saying? Isaac's 40 years old. So he's like not super young, he's not super old, but he doesn't have any kids yet, and he's just getting married. And so he gets his wife from about 500 miles northeast of where he's currently living, where his dad Abraham is from, right? Or at least where he spent some time, certainly. So they go back and they find like a relative of his, because that's how they did it back then, and brings her down like 520 miles or something like that to where he lives, right? So that's all that's saying. All those words is just where Abraham's family is from. So Abraham, verse 21, a problem happens. Isaac prayed to the Lord on behalf of his wife because she was childless. The Lord was receptive to his prayer, and his wife Rebekah conceived. So there's a huge lesson. So for those of you that remember the story of Abraham and Sarah, what did they do when they couldn't have kids? Yeah. They're like, you know what we should do? We'll just take this slave girl, and you can have sex with her, and we'll have a kid with her, and then we can take that child, and that child can be my son. And then the son was born, and immediately Hagar and Sarah hated each other. I wonder why. Like, why did that happen, right? Why didn't we see that one coming, Abraham and Sarah, right? And so there's this immediate division between the families, and it echoes for thousands of years. And so they went that way. But also, though, they were full of faith, right? Abraham and Sarah were. They believed in God, they trusted in God, but man, they were messy. Isaac, I wonder if he learned some lessons from dad and mom, because when they are up against this same situation, his response is just to pray about it. And God answered that prayer. Again, that principle, faith and prayer will guide you through difficult times. It's like, I think Isaac learned that lesson, maybe just watching his dad. Maybe he pulled away what was good, and part of the blessing that God passed to him was the wisdom and discernment to learn the lessons of his dad. Right? Like, am I going to be just like my dad, just like my mom always, or am I going to learn? Am I going to grow in my faith? And am I going to stay attached to my lifeline? Right? And maybe do things differently and learn what I can from them. All that good stuff you're seeing happening. And so what happens to Rebekah, though? Because we have choices when bad things happen. Are you going to be like Abraham and Sarah and rush it, be impatient, panic when bad things happen? Or are you going to be like what we just saw in Isaac? And are you going to be like what we're about to see in his wife, Rebekah? So here's what's happening with Rebekah. They pray, she gets pregnant, but the children, there's two inside of her, struggled with each other, and she said, why is this happening to me? Has anybody ever asked God that? Or just asked that out loud? Why is this happening to me? I'm a pretty good person. God, why are you doing this to me? Or how about this? Have you ever prayed about something? Like really prayed about it for maybe a long time, and then the answer that comes seems like a train coming at you on the train tracks? And it's just like, God, this is not what I asked for. This is not what I asked for, Lord. I asked you to help me with patience, and now you've given me Kyle as my husband, right? So it's like, why is this happening to me? So what's exactly happening to her? I didn't really notice this so much until I was like, well, what's going on here? So the words behind this, so the Greek word, struggled, that actually means, I want to make sure I got all the definitions right. It's not just struggled, it's violent collision, a crushing or a breaking between two things. So if you've ever been pregnant, imagine, ladies, that you've got violent collision happening in you, a crushing or breaking between these two twins. Like, there is like a UFC match happening in her belly. And she's like, I wanted to be pregnant, and now, Lord, you're ripping my insides to pieces, right? And so this is what she's feeling, and what's her response? Next verse, very next verse. In response to that difficulty, she went to inquire of the Lord. She remembered, I don't want to stay too far from my lifeline. Faith and prayer are going to guide us through difficult transitions. You see this over and over again happening with these people. It's like they're just learning as they grow as a family, as they move forward as a family. Still pretty imperfect. There's still some stuff coming in their stories that shows that they're not perfect people. But man, faith and prayer are going to guide us. Let's stay connected to our lifeline, right? So, verse 23, and the Lord said to her in response to that, 2 nations are in your womb. 2 people will come from you and be separated. 1 people will be stronger than the other, and the older will serve the younger. So there's going to be this struggle, God's saying, between Jacob and Esau, her 2 boys. And the older is going to have to serve the younger. That is like culturally upside down. What is interesting about this and a lot of things, because the Apostle Paul brings this up in the New Testament in Romans 9, and he says basically God can do what he wants to do. Like, God's not bound by our cultural norms, because those change like every 10 years. Now they change every 5 or 10 minutes. But our cultural norms don't have anything to do with God's plan, right? And that, again, it's cool to know like and understand things that have been true forever, not just for 10 minutes. And that's what we're talking about here. He's not bound by what we think is good or what we think is bad, right? Because what we thought in the 1800s was good is not what we think is good now. What the Romans thought was good, right, 2,000 years ago is not what we think is good now. What the Greeks thought before them, and on and on and on throughout history. What Hitler thought was good. What Mussolini thought was good. What Mao thought was good, right? All these places in history and all the people that followed them, right, it can't be relativistic. Because then it's like, well, then what do we do? So God is not bound by what we say is right and wrong. And that's an important lesson for us to remember. Because right now we're really fighting hard over that. And it's like, well, we need to reinterpret it because, it's modern day. I don't care how modern it is. We are a train wreck right now. So I'm not going to base my life off of where people are right now. I'm just not. Like, I want to base it in something that's always been true, right? And that's what we're seeing. Because the lifeline is there. And it attaches to something that's true and trustworthy and right. And that's not to be a butthead or jerk. We don't need to do that with our faith. But it's like, Thankfully, I'm connected to something that's just not leading me further off into the cave. It's not leading me down a side track. It's leading me to life. Amen? Right? That's what we got. That's what we see happening here, right? Okay, so when we go on, we see what happens to these two people. So when it came time for her to give birth, verse 24, there were indeed two twins in her womb. The first one came out red-looking, covered with hair like a fur coat, and they named him Esau. Now, I don't know about you, but I've always wondered this, like forever. So was Esau like a hairy Oompa Loompa? I thought that forever. I'm like, what is going on with this guy Esau? And then when you read children's Bible, we had a kid's Bible for my kids, and Esau looked like a hairy Oompa Loompa. And I'm like, there's no way that's what he really looked like, right? But I'm like, but there it is. They put it in there and they drew it, so that must have been it, right? So this week when I was studying this, and again, this is why kind of understanding and studying languages can be important. So I looked up, what does red looking actually mean? So I read some commentaries on it, I did a word study on it. It's the Hebrew word admonai. Now, admonai means ruddy or healthy. Now, if you are aware of your Old Testament, do you know what one other person, because this is only used of one other person, what one other guy was this word ruddy and healthy used of? King David. King David, as far as I know, was a ladies' man, right? This guy was a pretty good-looking dude, and that was something that kind of defined David, was the way he looked. And so when you say red looking, I think it'd probably be better to say that he was ruddy or healthy. Maybe he came out, I don't know, maybe he was red, but most babies are. They're like red and purple little aliens, right? And so it's I don't know, maybe that's what they're talking about. But realistically though, kind of take that cartoony image. He wasn't some red looking dude, but he was hairy. We can't remove that. That's a thing. He was just a hairy dude, right? So he just testosterone levels all the way up all the time, right? And so, but that's who he was. Right, and we'll learn more about him as we go. Now, Edom is where his descendants lived. So the cool thing about the Bible is names matter in the Bible. Nowadays, names just kind of all over the place, and it's just we don't necessarily get this in the 21st century. But back then, it spoke to who your family was, and if God gave you a name, it spoke to who you either were or you were going to be. Think Peter, right? You had a name change there with Peter, from Simon to the Apostle Peter, and I'm going to build my church on you and all that kind of stuff. So name changes in the Bible especially are important. So why do I point this out? So Esau, Hebrew word Esau, hairy is Sa'ir, and Seir is a territory in Edom where his family and his descendants would live. So all these words in Hebrew kind of sound somewhat similar. And so his name is just tied into who he would be and what he would be like, where his family even would live. And so the Edomites are a big problem in the Old Testament for the Israelites. And it all starts right here, right? So these names mean something. Now, his brother, on the other hand, verse 26, after this, his brother came out grasping Esau's heel with his hand. So he was named Jacob. Now, Isaac was 60 years old, so 20 years he had to wait for this. 20 years. Isaac was 60 years old when they were both born. Now, again, more wordplay. Why did he name him Jacob? Well, in Hebrew, again, in English, it's hard to get this. In Hebrew, heel is Acheb, deceived is Achab, and Jacob is Yaakov. So his name sounds like heel. It sounds like deceived. And in the Old Testament, this was not good because attacking somebody's heel was very reminiscent of the serpent in the garden. So he's going to have this idea attached to him for a long time that he's a deceiver. Not to mention what he's going to do, you'll see in coming weeks, what he does to his brother and how he deceives him. So this is his identity. But what I think is cool, though, and what I think maybe is cool for you, is you don't stay maybe where the mistakes are that you've made. In Scripture, with these very messy people, you just keep watching them be redeemed. That's really cool. If you've really screwed up your life and you're like, I have made so many mistakes that I don't know that I can come back from, and I'm embarrassed of, and I don't want people at my church to know that I've done that, wow. Just go to these people in Scripture and be like, well, I guess it wasn't that bad. And God redeemed them, and God used them. And Jacob, a guy who would be known in the first part of his life as a deceiver, by the end of his life, God himself is going to identify himself as this phrase right here. About a dozen times in the Bible, this next slide, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of who? His story started out as being a deceiver. And yet God himself is going to identify himself. Jesus Christ himself is going to look at God in the perspective of the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. I love the redeeming nature of what God does in people. And he can take even the worst of worst and just make something beautiful. It's a pretty powerful thing. They can take these awful guys that have, too much of the world in them and just do powerful things, life-changing, life-altering things. Now, this guy also, at the beginning of his story, is going to come into the middle of a lot of family drama. So if you feel like your family is a real mess, you are really good company in these chapters in Genesis, because Jacob is going to play a huge role in the Old Testament. He's going to take up a full 1/4 of the book of Genesis, he and his family, from now until the very end. So we're in chapter 25 now. He and his sons go all the way to chapter 50, right? But specifically focused on Jacob, he gets about 1/4. So there's a lot that's in here about him. And so here's what he's in the middle of. This Isaac and Ishmael, terrible separation, terrible issues in their family. Jacob and Esau, terrible fighting that would last forever, like it would last for hundreds of years between these two families. And then his own sons, Jacob's own sons, Joseph, is going to be sold into slavery after they contemplated killing him by his brothers, right? So if you're like, man, my family is so messed up, you're going to love Joseph and his brothers. They're a blended family, right? 4 different moms. Things are messy, like really messy with these people. And yet, God works in them all. And God redeems their stories. Even the mistakes that they made. Like, that's the cool thing about Genesis. Genesis ends in chapter 50 by Joseph making this statement that what you intended for evil, God intended for good. Like, man, that's like the story of all these messy people. Like, God just keeps redeeming and redeeming, showing up in messiness, showing up in the unfair, and just being there and working. It's so cool how near and present our Lifeline really is. So here's what I want to end with. Just a few things that we talked about today. I want you to think about your own transitions in life. It could be like going into middle school, right? It could be going into high school. It could be a new job, a new child, a new marriage, a new grandchild. It could be a death. It could be a lot of things. It could be what's going to happen between now and November and what's going to happen after November, right? There's going to be a lot of transitions in our country. My question is, like, what are you going to do during those transitions? Are you going to be an Abraham and panic? Are you going to be an Isaac? Are you going to go to prayer and you're going to stay connected to your lifeline, right? You going to stay connected to your lifeline or not? Think about your transitions and your difficulties, your uncertainties you got coming up. Second thing is, in the midst of all that, trust God's presence and promises through your faith and your prayer. So that's what I want to say. So the next slide is that you want to make sure you're focused on those two things. Faith in God and prayer to Him. Leaning into that. You actually have to use the lifeline, right? You actually have to use it. You just do. It's like I said, I think 3 weeks ago, when I first learned to rappel, what did I have to really trust? The equipment, didn't I? I had to trust what I'd been given. And what did God give us? Well, He's given us faith in Him, and He's given us prayer. Like, I have to trust these things, that they're going to lead me to life. And then thirdly, recognize and continue the spiritual legacy in your life and family. Stop making excuses. Stop being distracted and busy with dumb stuff, right? And recognize that you're leaving some kind of legacy. The question is, are you going to do it on purpose or not? You know what I'm saying? I don't care what age you are. I just am doing a marital counseling right now with two young adults in their early 20s. You say kids about adults when you're an old person now, but... And I said, I want you to think about this. You're in your early 20s, and culture takes about 3 to 5 years to build in an organization. Your marriage is your little mini organization, and you're building culture for the first 3 to 5 years of your relationship. Then what you're going to do is you're going to invite a kid into the culture that you've been building. What kind of culture are you inviting them into? So I don't care how old you are, you're building culture, right? The only question is, what kind are you building? Is it connected to this, or is you just doing your own thing? So, and I'll leave you with the last thought, and read it with me, just so we all got it. In every transition, faith and prayer will guide you. I've seen it in my life. I've seen it in the lives of others. I see it in the Word of God. It's real. God will guide you. Lean into your faith. lean into prayer. All right? So I'm going to close in prayer, but if you need to talk more about that, if you've not even accepted Christ as your Savior, if you're not even on that train yet, if you're not even a follower of Christ, come talk to me. If you need prayer about something, whatever. If you need prayer, come up here. We'll pray with you. We'll find somebody, either myself, one of our other leaders, we'll pray for you. And then, if you've got questions, if you want to get to know us a little bit more, over there in the small group room, right? It's our Discover class. Get connected, right? To a bunch of other people who are on the line, right? That's the cool thing about the church, is we're all just kind of holding on to this line. And when people drift off, it's like, hey, dummy, get back here. Grab the line. Grab the line. So let me pray. Lord, I thank you so much for who you are, what you do for us, Jesus. I thank you so much for the example of these really imperfect people, Lord, but how you redeemed them, how you were there, and God, how they grew in you. And I pray, Lord, that we would stay connected to our lifeline through faith and prayer, Jesus. Whether we're watching, whether we're here, whatever it is, God, would you please help us with that? Because we got to do it when life is good and bad and everything in between. And I ask that, God, in the power of your name, Jesus Christ. And his church said, Amen. All right, God bless you all. I love you. Have a great week.